Hello, everyone. It's right 7 on the dot here in Saskatchewan, so we'll get started, and folks can come in as they arrive. Welcome, everybody. I'll just ask, just as a quick reminder to everyone, some very simple Zoom etiquette, but it goes a really long way. If you can, please mute your microphone, unless you are contributing, of course, in a meaningful way to the workshop, and that will allow everybody's understanding to be much easier. So thank you for that. My name is Lenore Meyer. I'm the technical director here at Paved Arts. We are located on Treaty 6 territory, homeland of the Cree and Métis people. And we're very excited to be bringing a series of partner workshops, sound-based, audio-based workshops with Holophon in Regina. We have 4 workshops that we are bringing you in this partnership of sound-based workshops, and this is number 2. We had Ableton for Beginners with Wygretz from Regina a couple of weeks ago. And tonight we are very lucky to have Adam Basanta joining us from Montreal. And I'd like to welcome him and also welcome you all here. There's a lot of really wonderful faces in the Zoom box, and it's really nice to see lots of you. And I know that there's a really big shared interest amongst all of us for sound art and manipulation of sound. And I think there's a lot of wonderful people here. So it's just really nice to see that. So I'd like to thank you all. I'll pass it along to Ian, because I know Ian would like to speak a little bit about Holophon, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few words about Holophon. Holophon engages communities using sound as an artistic medium, promoting sound art and experimental music through live performances, concerts, workshops, community events, and educational programming. Holophon works to increase awareness of and develop sound art practices in the province of Saskatchewan and to encourage and facilitate discussion around critical and creative listening. We'd also like to thank multiplay.ca for helping us fund these workshops. As Lenore said, this is the second one we've done, so this is the end of our spring series, but we're going to be programming a bunch of new workshops in the fall, so please stay tuned for our upcoming advertising on that, so you can visit our website, or Instagram is also a good place to find out about Holophon stuff coming up. Thanks a lot. I'll throw it back to Lenore.
Thank you, Ian. If you would like to ask a question at some point, please feel free to type it into the chat. If you can't locate that, there's a dashboard at the bottom of your Zoom kind of console, and there is a chat icon there. If you click on it, it will open up a chat box, and you can type in your questions or comments there, and I will do my best to make sure that they are addressed. It also might end up organically being a situation where we can unmute and just ask as well, and we'll just let that naturally kind of sort itself out. But if you do have questions, please feel free to contribute and ask that. So with that, I'd like to welcome Adam, and take it away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Holophon and Paved, and all of you joining. Yeah, let's get right to it. First of all, very happy to see the people here and a couple of familiar names and faces. So it's nice that we can take advantage of the pandemic in some ways. I don't think I would be giving a workshop in Saskatoon or Saskatchewan unless I was actually there. So it's nice that we can kind of share this virtual space together. Just a little bit of context. Most of what we'll do will be applied with the audio editor and DAW. But just to tell you a bit about my approach, I work across several disciplines, and sound is kind of my first discipline. I studied music, so I was very involved in experimental composition, and move towards sound installations and later more visual art. But sound is still kind of bread and butter for me. It's still something that I think about a lot, and in many ways, stepping away from it a bit has given me a lot of, I feel it's given me a lot of perspective on how I used to practice and how I practice now, especially with relevance to technology. There's no, before I continue, actually, I should say, in terms of questions, if there is something organic and relevant, please unmute your mic and, just go ahead. The chat is really good. If it's kind of not directly relevant, and I'm going to really try to leave 15 minutes at the end so we can just chat about whatever you want to talk about. But the chat's a good place to save that if you're not sure you'll remember. The general approach that I've been moving towards personally is to teach these workshops without any specific software or plugins in mind. In a way, it doesn't really matter how advanced you are when we talk about advanced. We're usually talking about technical familiarity, because we're not really going to cover very advanced technical topics. What I think is maybe more interesting to think about is to develop together and discover our each individual kind of mental or psychological approach to working with technique rather than concentrating on the technique itself. And that's basically trying to shift or play with the shifting that we can perform with our own listening when we're listening to sounds. And of course, this is not even with a specific genre or media in mind. It obviously will lend itself to experimental music, to film sound design, sample making, electronic music, mixing, acoustic music. But honestly, because it is more of a mental shift, I think it could be relevant in other adjacent non-technical fields, like sound walking, for instance. Another little note about tools. I know there's going to be some of you for whom you probably already know this, but there's something funny that happens as technology becomes more democratized, and there's more access, and we have more computing power, and so we have fancier plugins and all that. It's really a great thing. But the flip side of it, I think, is there's a bit of a conundrum here. The more sophisticated and complex a tool is, the more specific and restrictive the use of it becomes. Meaning, if we both have a very, very sophisticated tool that does something very complex, and I'm using it and you're using it, the end results are going to be fairly close because that tool is highly specific at doing something very complex. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing wrong with using complex tools, but in the kind of ecosystem of gear and plugins and all that, I think it is something to keep in mind. And in the inverse is that a general principle or a very generalized tool, precisely because of its generality, it can create a lot of variation. You can use it in many, many different ways. You can even use it in the same way and apply it differently and end up with a very, very different results. So the chance, if we're trying to develop personal language with working with sound, generalized tools and simple tools actually afford a lot more of that, I think. And that's, again, kind of going to be the focus here. Now, that doesn't mean that just because the tool is simple, that the result is simple. The idea is to take these simple operations and iterate them and layer them and place them one after the other and one on top of the other. And the result becomes, I would argue, more complex sounding than a very, very fancy plugin, for instance, that you just pop on and put preset on. Finally, about tools, again, the tool that hopefully we can either start developing or continue developing in the workshop is the big muscle between our ears. you know, our brain is, that's the most important tool that we're all going to use, whether we're working with sound or not. And like any muscle, I think the hearing muscle is one that can be stretched and worked out and exercised, and we can develop new capacities that way. So this is a bit the perspective that I'm working from. If you're a musician, you may have heard the saying, if you can't hear it, you can't play it. The idea of becoming aware of what it is that I'm hearing, break it down, what is it that I want to hear, developing that muscle is going to make it a lot easier to get from point A to point B. Now the title of the talk has the word sound object in it, and that's something that I just want to touch on really briefly. Sound object, you may have heard the term before. I'll just tell you how I'm defining it for the workshop, and then I'll touch a bit on the baggage. The idea of a sound object is not an object that is being recorded. It's not like a literal object. It's not like, oh, I want a sound object. Here's a oh, you can't see because I'm on a tropical island, but here's a notebook, you know, it's an object. This is not what I'm going to mean when in this workshop. A sound object is any sound that has been recorded. It doesn't have to be an object. And some of the samples I've distributed, and any sample that you have on your computer could be used for this workshop. The idea of the sound object is the sound by virtue of the act of recording and that distancing that it creates, both in terms of a distance of perspective of becoming the recordist, the distance in time of between the recording and the editing and the compositional use. Through that act, the sound can become like an operable object, an object that we can manipulate in many different ways. And we can think of physical equivalents to the kind of manipulations we're going to do. We're going to cut and copy and paste and stretch and flip and invert and stretch vertically, stretch laterally, layer it, create a structure with it. So all of this stuff is, of course, you do it whenever you're making music with a computer, but the idea is to really focus and to allow the fact that we've distanced ourselves from what the sound is and from what the original moment of recording was, to give us a different perspective on the sound and the way that we work with it, and the way that we are able to zoom in or attune ourselves to features of it. Now, there is a heritage that this term comes from, of musique concrète, of acousmatic music, and I think the important thing to remember, if you're not familiar with it, you know, look it up, Google it. I won't really go into it. What I will say is that I think the shortcomings with a lot of musical philosophies that use sound object as a very important concept is that, you know, you lose perspective. You've zoomed in so much that it starts to become the only way that you listen to or relate to a sound. And what I want to encourage is a variable zoom. Okay, so we're going to zoom in, and once we've heard the sound as a sound object, we can always zoom back out. And in fact, I think it's necessary, and I think we do it anyway. So it's not the only way to hear a sound, and it shouldn't be. But it's a tool. It's a kind of a mindset that I think can get us somewhere. And from there we can take it in other directions. I just want to show really one slide, to be honest, before we continue. And that's this. Okay, so this is not the perfect visual representation, but I want us to look at sounds like we're looking at this, you know, square right there. Okay, these are the samples that I've given you, each one, or the samples that you have on your computer or your synthesizer patch or whatever, you know. Now, the reason I'm showing it this way is this is how you see it on the computer, and we can take advantage of it. Meaning, you're seeing something that unfolds in time and in spectral space, and you're seeing it kind of set on the screen. Okay? And we can see it has some features. It has this gradient or whatever. You know, we can inquire into it. But we're seeing it from a bird's eye view, and that is how it's not how we hear it, but it's how we see it in the computer. So let's push this a bit further. We have this sound object. What are the axes in this representation? We can think of a lateral axis. So sounds unfold in time. So this could be the development of a sound in time. I think once you start listening to sounds as a sound object, you'll also start hearing that most sounds are made up of many, many, many sounds that occur in sequence. So there's an element of we create a gestalt of the sound, but it's actually possible in this perspective to break it down to components in time. This is the horizontal dimension. We have the vertical dimension is the spectrum. If you're not totally familiar with the spectrum, with the idea of a frequency spectrum between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, which is our hearing range as human beings, ideally, you can think about the piano keyboard. Okay, there's lower sounds and there are higher sounds. That metaphor is very, very powerful for us because it corresponds to the way that frequencies build up in the harmonic spectrum vertically. Now, right now, I would say this is a sound object, but it's not a very interesting sound. And that's because it's flat. So the third way to think about a sound object, if we can look at this as a three-dimensional object, but we're looking at it from a square perspective. So we only see it as two-dimensional. But once we add that third dimension, okay, because this is an object and we can move around it like an object, we can pause, we can concentrate on specific features, we will start to hear space very strongly as well. And that's depth is I think the key to a good sample is in its depth. And that doesn't mean adding a bunch of reverb on it. That means that the sound itself has a depth component to it, which can come from space or spatial placement, but also comes from layering. So what does this mean in more practical senses? I'm sure you've all had a little bit of experience with a DAW or an audio editor, and you know a couple of basic things you can do with sounds, with samples, and I'm sure some know much more advanced stuff. On the lateral dimension, that was a late arrow. On the lateral dimension, we can cut, we can move, we can paste, we can loop, we can stretch, etc. So we're always working with expanding or manipulating the sound object laterally. Vertically, we're talking about the spectral domain, so we can think about EQ or filtering. That could be a corrective EQ, it could be a mixing EQ, and it could be an extreme EQ or a very the idea of an EQ is a magnifying glass, or filters a magnifying glass rather than just something that helps fit the sound in the mix or helps the sound be more than what that it is. Transposition is another way, of course, of moving things around in the vertical plane. And you have some effects are going to resist categorization. So if you're familiar with granulation or granular synthesis, it's a time-based effect that generates a very rich vertical spectrum. So it's, fit in either way, but I'm going to think about it as vertical. Depth, we're going to, again, think about layering, and this will make a bit more sense, all this layering talk once we get into an audio editor. Spatial simulation, so pan, reverb, delay, resonator bank. These are all ways of simulating a kind of space. And I would highly discourage using reverb all the time because in fact, it leads to a lack of depth in your mix, I would say. And then spatial effects, which I hope we'll have a bit of time. I'll show you a little bit of my approach for playing with reverb in a way that doesn't end up sounding like reverb. That becomes more spectral qualities that are layered in the background but are not simulating a specific space. So keep this idea in mind of the lateral, the vertical, and the depth, and we'll kind of go through it and do a bit of a back and forth on it. To do that, we're going to need an audio editor, and I distributed a little collection of samples. Actually, I'm going to play the samples first. You can use those samples for anything you want. There's one that is copywritten. It's a sample from a Ligeti piece, so maybe don't use that one. But the rest are just sounds I've recorded over the years. I believe that there was an email maybe, but if you don't have the samples on hand, that's fine. You can use any sample in your computer. I'd recommend recorded sound and not synthesizers for now. It'll just make it easier with my examples. So I'll just play them really quick for you. You can also see how I label sounds. I have a few field recordings. I have a recording of a car horn. I have environments in a restaurant. I have an underground tunnel here in Montreal. And then I have a few objects that I recorded. This coin spin, which, if I may say so myself, is a finely recorded sample that took a lot of prep work to do. I have a door closing. Paper crumpling, and a paper rip, which was recorded in stereo as well. It doesn't really matter what sample you're going to use. To be completely honest, I'm going to start with a coin sample one, but the door one would also work great for this first exercise. The first thing that I'd like to propose, and it's not an essential step, and it feels a bit old school to insist on it, but I like working with an audio editor before I go into a DAW. It's just an extra step. It's just an extra thing for me to pause and to listen to the sounds without worrying about mixing, without worrying about where they go in time. I'm just going to edit them. I'm going to clean them up. I'm going to start developing clusters of sounds, or composite sounds. And then I'm going to do my composition in the DAW, and I'm going to worry about all my mixing and my time-based effects and stuff like that. You can do all of what I'm going to do now in the DAW. I just find it distracting, like there's just too many things to do. So I like to take this extra step. So I'm using Audacity, which is an open source software audio editor, but you can use any audio editor you would like. Of course, we have the sample here is our coin, just to refresh your memory. The first thing that I would do, probably, if I'm approaching this, is I would just start looping the sample. Again, it's just, don't think about it as a technical trick. Think about it as a mental trick. It's pretty famously the beginning of musique concrète as a discipline, the loop, an accidental loop. So I think it's a really great way of starting to distance myself from what the sound is towards what is in the sound. So I'm going to loop playback this sample a couple times and just start to listen to it, start to hear it, and I'm going to concentrate on the lateral dimension first of all. So, I mean, it's not the first time I've heard the sample, but just looping it 3 times, I do hear 3 distinct sections here, which could be a helpful thing while I'm editing. There's the initial drop of the coin that's there. In fact, if you really wanted, you could cut it even a bit shorter. It doesn't even sound like a coin. Then you have this kind of like cluster of coins that fall all at once. And then you get the coin starting to spin. And then you kind of have 2 different kinds of spin. That's one, and that's the other one. So there's something here that's already different in rhythm than, there's some similarities. And here, actually, this end there is also very, very, very different. Now, notice also what happens as soon as I start just playing selections, especially as they've looped a few times. Like the original sample is gone from my head when I hear this sound, you know. And of course, the shorter I'm going to cut it, the more I'm going to disassociate it from what it is. And that could be interesting or uninteresting, both conceptually and sonically to your practice. But just to demonstrate, like a very, very short slice, a very, very short slice is, yeah, it approaches definitely the granular. And I'm actually a huge fan of doing granular type effects. If you're not familiar with granular, it's like you're grabbing little bits of the sound, micro sound kind of components, and rapidly sequencing them one after the other. I really like granular effects, but I would say that, again, granular synthesizers are complex tools, and they can tend to sound kind of similar. Like I can hear certain granular synthesizers by this point. So like there's a lot to be said for like a more bespoke approach, for lack of a better word, of chopping really small sounds, or writing your own algorithm for chopping small sounds and sequencing them like that. It will sound granular, but it might not sound like that granulator that your friend also uses. There's also, like, in terms of micro editing, that I quite like, where the shorter the sound is, right, the more you gain in spectrum. It's a strange thing. That's how granular synthesis works too. The shorter and the less smoothed out your envelope is, and here we have no envelope, we have no fade in or out, the more it's going to generate vertical spectrum. The sound will become noisier, in other words. And you can really hear that at a certain point, and I'm not nearly at the sample level, I'm still dealing with quite a few samples here, but if I could, I think in Audacity, I can just play one sample. One sample is a click. That's all it is. Or rather, the transition between your one sample and 0 is always a transition between 0 and an unsmoothed number. You know, maybe it's not 1 in amplitude, but it's always going to generate a click, basically. And it's a bit of an aesthetic preference, but I love glitchy sounds, and like editing things like this, trying to grab really small bits. What does a small bit from here sound? And what if I just can create it's like a slight EQ on the sound. And you can very rapidly build a huge sound bank from a very short sample by using this approach. Of course, grab somewhere else in the sound, and you're going to get a different sound. I'm not suggesting necessarily that this is my finished sample. For instance, like let's say I really like this click. It's really, for some reason, I'm enamored by it. I'm going to copy it and I'm going to paste it on a new track here. And then, you know, I'll do the same again. I'll take this one and do the same thing. I'm not suggesting that that's the end of our journey with that micro sample. I mean, you can EQ it, you can do a lot of stuff to it after. This, as I have it right now, actually, when you loop them very fast, you get a pitch sound. It's more like a wavetable synthesis kind of approach. But if I can spread them a bit out in time, so they'll be slightly separate, you will hear that if you like this sort of glitch vocabulary, you can just run with this. You don't need much else. And at the same time, if you're not into that, or you want to twist it a little bit and make it a little bit less harsh, all of the stuff that I'm gonna do it on larger section of the samples, making composite sound objects, it can be exercised with these short samples as well. Okay, so just really quickly, right? I have the three parts of the sound, and one lateral move I could do, for instance, would be to find this loop point here, a good loop point. Maybe need to adjust it. One sort of lateral transformation can be not just to cut the sounds and separate them, which is what I was starting to do there. And certainly, you know, I could take one of the big transients, I'll do that later, and I'll pop it on the track and start messing around with it. But another thing you can do laterally is to start rearranging these components and to play with them. And, you know, a coin, we're not really thinking about this as a coin spin, but there's something in the energy of something spinning that is hardwired in our brain, you know, that we understand how it works physically. And so messing around with that is also very much a possibility. For instance, pasting, another instance of it. So I've just extended my coin spinning. It still sounds fairly organic, you know. I can start messing with it laterally by taking a section here, copying, pasting, reversing. Okay, so this is, again, I'm just working laterally. I'm not thinking vertically at all here. This is just an exercise in thinking about the sound laterally. And I'm going to bring that reversed portion in, and my loop might not be perfect because I'm not really paying too much attention, doing it fairly quickly, but so I've now reversed it, and now I'm going to create something that really is kind of a strange departure from the original, or a stretching of what the original is. So very simple example of taking and separating sounds into different components. Just really quickly to show you with a different sample, my door closing one I think is a good example as well, because again, we can separate this laterally very easily, and there's a couple of good samples here that can be used for something. So if we listen a couple of times, let's try this together. I mean, what do we hear? How many sounds can you separate it into? And feel free to unmute or chime in the chat. We have some 3 sounds. So I mean, we can agree that the thud for sure. Yeah, exactly. So this, I mean, that is 1 sound. So you know, I can always separate that out. That's easy. Even in the thud, there's a few. Yeah, you're right, because it's kind of like there's like a flam. There's a flam in there, you know, in that door closing. So maybe if we actually we can separate this. That was good. I didn't even hear it the first time. So we have flam, and we have just the hit. Okay, so that's already 2 samples. And then you can't really hear the handles so well, but you can kind of pick it up. There's like a little. It's not dramatic enough to really separate it into its own sample unless you. Well, I mean, you could use that as a percussive sample for sure. And then, of course, we have the squeak. And I'm going to copy this and I'm going to throw it over here because I'll definitely do something with that. And we have this kind of, now that I kind of hollowed out the middle of the sound, I created this new rhythm of the handle squeak plus the creak, but without the squeak that precedes the creak. So here there's that at the end. It's again very different. And then we have here a bit similar to before. I mean, you can really see how the looping destroys any sense of context of what the sound is, especially once we've gone inside the sample. We're just playing a section of it. Okay, so that's lateral. Although there are a few transformations I want to kind of. Let's take less than 10 minutes, like 5-10 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I encourage you to take 1 sample, say the coin or the door, and start separating it into 2 or 3 sounds. And think, you know, don't take too long doing it because you can always do this again. But try to have a couple of different sound types. For instance, a percussive sound and a resonance or the squeak or something like that. And then we're going to come back and we're going to start working with it vertically. All right. So I'll just, if there are any questions, chime in. I'll mute my mic for now.
There's a question in there. How do I reverse a track or a sample?
Thank you. Christian, it depends a little bit on whether or not you're using Audacity or not. If you are using Audacity, you select the file and then go to the Effect menu and then reverse. You'll see that there's other things there as well. Okay, maybe make your final adjustments there. I'm going to share my session again. Really brief note on editing stuff. Let's say I wanted to grab this this section of the sound, right? I would copy, paste it to a new track. Okay, now I just have that. Great. This is a percussive sound, so before I would do anything, even if it wasn't a percussive sound, but especially in the percussive sound, before I'm going to do anything, I'm going to clean up the sample. That's going to be my first move, because once I clean the sample, I can manipulate it in 100 different ways, and it's going to start with a clean sample. Otherwise, I'm going to have to clean each one up individually. One thing that for a percussive sample is, of course, important is to cut it right at the beginning. So I'll really zoom in there and trim it so it starts right away. If you're putting it into a sequencer or something like that, or a drum machine, that's going to be super important. I'm going to probably fade this out because I did cut it out of the sample. And I'm not even sure if well, I'll keep this little end for now, let's say. I'm going to go again to the effect menu and fade out. You can see there are a lot of things you can do here, but the reason we are doing a fade out, and in fact, in this specific sample, we don't need to do a fade in, because if you see, it starts right at 0 because it was the beginning of the sound. But let's say I picked this section of the sound here. So if we take a look here, and I'm gonna zoom in there. Let's say that it was cut like that. Okay, say that was, for some reason, it was just a bad cut or something. This is going to generate a click, and it's not going to be a click that you can control too much, like the kind of glitchy edits I was talking about before. This is just bad editing, right? Basically, you can see that this is sample by sample values. So you can see that we're going from 0 to whatever that is. It's not 0 in 0 seconds. We have to switch, and that's how clicks are created. So even for a percussive sample that needs to have a sharp attack, I'm probably going to go and I'm going to just fade in a few samples. Is all that's really, really necessary. You can go a bit further if you want it, but you see now I'm starting at 0. I'm not going to have a click there. It's going to be a nice sample. Now, when I reverse it, when I transpose it, when I do anything else, I'm dealing with a clear. Oh, thank you. I'm dealing with a clear sample. There was actually not very much there to listen to, so you didn't miss out a lot. It's just when we break, I need to switch it. I need to switch it to the internal sound card so I can hear something. Selected 0 crossing by pressing Z is something to do in Audacity. Every audio editor will have a 0 crossing option somewhere buried, and I would suggest, especially when you're doing editing, looping, stuff like that, it'll just make your life easier. You want the sound to always cross at the 0 point to avoid the click. Okay, we're just dealing with this sample here right now, and it's, it doesn't have a lot to it right now. I'll admit, this is just kind of, it's half metallic, half wood. That's what it sounds like to me, But I want to start thinking about the vertical dimension here. And I want to start with, before we get into EQs, which we'll spend a lot of time on, I want to look at transposition. These classic tape techniques, I think, they're just so versatile, and they're still so original sounding today. Because it really depends on your sample. So I think if you record your own sample and then you start transforming it with these tools, you're gonna get very unique sounds. So to transpose a sound in Audacity, we are going to select whichever little part that we cut, and we are going to go to Effect. And there are different ways of transposing. Change pitch is one way to transpose. It's a way that decouples the vertical dimension. So you can transpose while still maintaining the same time domain that you had. So the sample will be the same length. Sometimes you got to do change pitch. But honestly, something gets lost in the sound when you do it. I'm very rarely satisfied with it. I much prefer to change speed. like a record player. Okay, it spins slower and the sound is lower and it takes longer to spin. I find the results are much more organic than when you just change the pitch. But try it out for yourself. I'll just preview a couple of things. Here's our original sound. It's always nice to jump in octaves just to get a sense of the range. So 0.5 multiplier is going to be 1 octave below the original. Okay, there's a bit more meat to it. 2 is going to be twice as high, so one octave higher. Now, you can see that this is really starting to lose its material quality. Like it almost sounds like a hi-hat here. Maybe if I go to 3 or 4, I really could use it as a hi-hat-like element. When you go lower, we can get into really interesting territories because as we stretch the sound laterally and vertically, we're transposing it, but by transposing it, we're also stretching it. We can start to hear things that we may have not heard in the first time around because it was just going too fast. And slowing things down is just a really powerful tool. This is still, fairly recognizable. Here we can start to get into pretty different territory, I feel. We can hear that little thing at the end that I didn't remove in the edit, and that's why I didn't remove it, because I thought it actually could be pretty interesting. I'm just gonna show you even lower than that. I mean, not exactly at an octave, but at some point, we're not just talking about changing the pitch of our sound object. We're changing the physical dimensions of the sound object. I mean, when we think again about the kind of Necker cube I was showing you before, and the idea that space doesn't mean reverb. This sound right here, it has space in it. It has a lot more space than this sound. This sound is right there, right in front. It's a really small. It has no interiority to it. It's a surface impact. Okay, and as I lower it 4 octaves or so below, 5 octaves below, all of a sudden I'm making this object so much physically bigger that it creates an emptiness inside it, a resonance to it. And if we keep going lower, it's just going to be amplified. And you can start to hear a pitch that you didn't hear before. Just listen to just the very top of the sound right now. Not the low thud, just the very high frequency stuff there. There's a note. There's a note that I could not hear there, it's just not evident at that point. But as I'm slowing it down, I'm revealing, I'm magnifying these elements. And if I'm into it, I can keep magnifying it with, let's say, a filter, let's say an EQ, stuff like that. But I got to find it first. And of course, there you have kind of like a big gong, So, it's a really common technique. There's nothing super. It's actually much simpler algorithmically than the change pitch algorithm. But I think it always has a lot of potential, and it's really interesting to hear how the sounds change just using this effect. So let's take another 10 minutes or so. Now you have probably a few samples. Like I have one, maybe clean it up with a fade. Start playing with the transposition. And when you are happy with it, let's say I'm happy with this variation here. Of course, I'm just going to press OK. You can see that my sound file changed, and And now I can, I'll actually undo it. I'll copy, I'll paste the new copy. So I have another clean one so I can process again. Okay, and then I'll do the same thing here. And now I already have 2 samples. So take just one of the samples that you've separated, do a few transpositions, find a few different things in that sound. Okay, and then we're going to reconvene. We're going to start putting these things together vertically and horizontally. Okay, I'm gonna take over again. So, where am I here? Share screen. Yeah. So, basically, once you process these samples, the idea is not to continue working in Audacity forever, but to use this kind of iterative approach. So we've taken one sample, we've extracted at least one sample from that. We've now transformed. We have like a little family of related sounds. Okay, they'll share something with the original because we transposed it. Maybe some are more distant relatives. Like if you reverse it, it's not going to be as close as just a transposition. But okay, we have something. We can keep extracting these things, and every time we're happy with something, we just export that as a sample. And we just know, like, when it's satisfying to us and to our ears, we just save it as something and just continue on developing. And in fact, we're going to keep iterating it. But just before I go into that, I just wanted to show you. I made a few variations, a few transpositions here, and they're fairly interesting percussion sounds, I would say. I quite like this one again because of the high tone. You guys can hear me now, right? Yeah. Okay. So we have that high resonance that we just couldn't. I mean, we're transposing something that was just too high, and like now it's in a very prominent range. You can also think about stretching. We talked a little bit about granulation, and actually preparing for a workshop with much younger people, like in a college here. I was shocked to see that pulse stretch is actually offered in Audacity. If you don't remember pulse stretch, it was like a like independent granular stretching software. It was that you only had 2 parameters: how long you want it to be, like multiply by how long, kind of thing. And I think the window, like it gave you like a value for the window. I gotta say, I was thrilled to see that pulse stretch is still alive and well inside Audacity. So it's not the most sophisticated granular synthesizer, but it sure works. Playing around with the time resolution is definitely worth your while when you have the time to concentrate on it. I'll just show you. First of all, you can see I'm only selecting the resonance. I'm not selecting the beginning because I don't really need. If I select the beginning, I'm going to stretch the attack, and I'm going to get this kind of like multiple attacks at the very beginning of my sound, which is not what I specifically want. I just want to stretch the resonance here. So I'm selecting the resonance and stretch it by 20 is maybe a bit exaggerated. Let's say 8. And there is a much longer version of the resonance. I think that was all right. Of course, it's still connected to the attack, and that's a decision I can make now or when I'm starting to compose. Do I always want it connected to the attack? Obviously, there's nothing suggesting I have to use the attack, but it's a nice way. An attack is really good because it masks what happens right after. Our ears are very sensitive to attacks, and in fact, protect you from from ear damage from transient sounds. So it's a really great moment to make a transition to something because we're concentrating on something else. You know, we're concentrating on the attack. So here is just an extended resonance of this sound, and there's a little fade thing I would be fixing if I was really going to use this. But you can see how it's not quite that dramatic in this sample because it was already stretched with the classic transposition. But surely if we take this squeak, for instance, and let's just see what happens if we change the speed. We'll really like stretch it this way, and now we're going to use pulse stretch as well. And we'll stretch it times 8 as well. And let's just hear the difference in these two kinds of lateral stretching and what it does vertically speaking as well. So here's our classic transposition. It's a very dramatic transformation. I mean, I took it down quite a few octaves, so much so that squeak ends up being in like a low vocal range almost, and it has a very vocal quality to it. If I wanted, I could filter everything else out other than just that, kind of wolf howl kind of thing. So this is one way of stretching it, and here's pulse stretch. Okay, so of course we're not stretching it, we're not transposing it down, so we have a very big difference in pitch, but also there's a difference in texture. There's a difference in like you can hear it in pulse stretch. You can hear the windows a little bit, the granular windows. You hear the glissando, and of course if we kept stretching it, we will get more and more of that evident in the sound. You can also very clearly hear two different frequencies, like a harmonic on the left that's higher than the one on the right. And here's the glissando starting. And notice that there's a lot of air on the bottom end of that sound. It's like you can really hear if might as well get into EQs a little bit. If I use an EQ, and I'm gonna use a specific one simply because it is well, you'll see why I'm using that one. Sorry, I missed something in the chat. Yeah, Melda, yeah. I wanted to use something that anybody could get for free. So Melda is a free one. Going back to the idea of training the muscle, the listening muscle, I highly recommend when you're starting to really, like if you're taking an hour out of your day to EQ a sound, which is a funny thing to say, but sometimes you need to do that. I really highly recommend training yourself with an analyzer. So the reason that I'm using this specific plugin is because it has a spectrum analyzer built in. And it's about building a muscle. It's about building the capacity to work without the analyzer, right? But it can really help to have the visual correspondence. And sometimes it's always good to like double check and you're like, oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the bottom there that I didn't hear because my speakers are not that good or something like that. So I'm not using this EQ specifically for its character or algorithm or anything like that. I'm mostly using it as an analyzer. And what I was kind of hearing there was, especially in the second half of the sound, you can hear, again, I was talking about two sounds. We have, I'm just gonna use a tighter cue. This note here and that note there. Okay. And then we have this stuff here, okay? All of this. This is the kind of low air that I was talking about. Now, I'm not even thinking about this from a mixing point of view. I'm thinking about this still just from a sound object point of view. I have a decision to make here, or I can make a couple of decisions, but I need to at least split this sound into two. That's how I would deal with it. I would say, you know, those high harmonic stretches, they're, you know, they have a good effect, and that's one type of sound. And for that, I don't need the low end in there. That low end it's only going to interfere with something else in the mix. I guarantee it. I don't even know what my composition is going to be. I know it's going to be in the way. But just in case I'm not sure, maybe there's something in that sound also to explore. So it would be two different processes. So I would take this, I would copy it, and now I'm just going to work with this one section here, and I'm gonna start first by just filtering out the highs completely, the lows completely, sorry. So it's up to you as to where does low start, I suppose. I'm going to say very generally, you almost, unless it's a sound that's going to provide a real bass function in your piece in some way, you probably don't need anything under 100 hertz. It's mostly clutter. It's mostly going to clutter with other stuff. So if you don't need it, I always err on the side of removing it, if not completely, at least dampening it. Oh my God, I have to reshare my screen. Oh, you don't see the plugin?
No, yeah.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought it was just sharing it.
Okay, it looked normal to me, but I wasn't aware that there was a plugin I was supposed to be seeing.
One second. I think it's like, because it's a new window. I apologize. We're all learning how to do this online. You can see it now.
There we go. Yeah.
Okay. So you must have thought I was hallucinating, talking about the spectrum and all that. Okay, so just to show you that I was looking at the spectrum, here's the high end. Sorry, here's the high end. One note, second note. Okay, there's some high air here, but it's not really a note anymore. We have this stuff here it's in between. There's not really a lot there. And then we have this low end, right? Now, I just want to listen to this low end for a second and see if it's worth salvaging, you know, because that's a real question at this point. But what I would say is, even just sweeping through there, you know, was kind of interesting. Like, I really love filtering. I think it's the best effect, basically. You can do so much with it, and it has a real emotional impact or emotional resonance to it, I feel. It's the equivalent for me of a colorful slide that you shoot video through. You know, it's like a piece of colored cellophane that you're still showing the real world through, and it's very powerful in that way. So we'll do the easy thing first, which is just to get rid of the lows. Get rid of the lows, and then the Melda plugins are free. Yeah. So something like this, and you know, this filter doesn't actually have this EQ doesn't have a low pass filter or a high pass filter, so I kind of have to like mess with it a bit more than I would otherwise to really cut the lows, but it's a bit strange that this one doesn't have it, to be honest. But okay, I have one sound here. I'm going to apply it, and I can always save that as a sample. And now I know that I have this really pure kind of thing. And this is a resonance. This resonance, it's not finished, but it could be attached to an attack. It could precede an attack. It could be in layers of resonance. There's lots of ways that I can use it. I can start taking that and transposing it, and you can see how this iterative process, you know, would take potentially weeks before you really start to play with the composition. But the whole time you're listening and you're internalizing the sounds, and you're understanding what's in them and how to get them to where you want to go. But just to give an example of what to do with the other side of the patch, which was the low. Sorry, where is it? Yeah. If I just want to use the lows and I don't want to use the highs, what do I do then? So you want to cut the highs, and you know, I think it's nice to keep a little bit of them in there, just like a hint, ghostly kind of hint. And there's something there. I would be very careful with this type of sound, because more than one of these in your mix and it's over. So I would really investigate whether there's something worth saving here, and that would be more. So if I loop this part of the sound here, I'm going to start looking for resonances in there that are interesting. So I'm going to sweep with not a super narrow, not a super wide EQ, and I'm only going to boost about 6 dBs, because otherwise you start getting into like resonant filter territory, and everything sounds like a resonant filter at that point. I'm trying to find something that's already in there. I'm just going to sweep through and see if I get there. Maybe there's something there. Maybe right there. You know, I have this resonance, this higher resonance that's a little bit more. It's a little bit more interesting, and it's not in the sub bass, so I already kind of like it. I'll maybe try to see if I can find, once you find a high harmonic, you can always try to find the lower one, or if you find a lower one, you're like, oh, what frequency am I at? 356. Okay, double it. Maybe there's something around 660. You know, so there's a lot of shortcuts you can use with the analyzer this way. There's actually not a lot here in the sound, you know, so I tend not to boost, let's say, bass, you know, if it's not there in the sound. Like I've tried, I don't feel there's a lot there in this real sub bass, and in fact, I'll find another sound to satisfy that function, a sound that actually has bass, and then I can work with it, and I can EQ that bass, and I can carve it out and really work with it. So I probably would even cut the lows just to declutter it and just keep it kind of like this. So this would be another sound that I'm you know, that I would create, and then I only process part of it, but you get the point, I think. the idea is that I'm creating these families, I'm creating these families, and at some point I'm gonna start transitioning from the single sample, which is what I'm working with, and I'm gonna try to move towards composites. So the idea of a composite sound is you're gonna take a few samples and you're gonna layer them together. You've listened to them carefully, so you're aware of what's inside them. You're aware of their envelope. You're aware how they can connect in a chain, let's say, or be vertically stacked is the easiest way to create a composite sound object. And this is going to add vertical space. It's going to fill the vertical space, but it's really going to actually start adding depth into the sound. The idea is that if I have my frequency time kind of axes there, and that's one sample, that's the first sample, untreated or whatever, transposed, coin dropping on the ground or something. That if I take two other sounds from that same family that have been treated a little bit differently, and I'll line them up together, I'm gonna get a composite sound. I'm gonna get a sound that it all is following the same envelope. They're all gonna be percussive in this example. And it's gonna maintain a very organic quality to it. And it's gonna create a hyper real quality to it. And it's gonna be very difficult to know what that sound is and how you got to that sound, honestly, because there's not a clear path to it. You really need to work your samples and know them. And try to combine them in an original way. So these are a couple of examples from a piece I wrote, many years ago. So it's you can look it up online. The first few samples are just going to be the actual samples that I used without any processing. So they're individual samples. So it was another kind of barn door, I think, or something closing. That was just kind of a thud, and that was, I don't remember what that came from, but I think it's part of the sound. It sounds really chopped, is that by layering those three together and EQing each one of them separately, but thinking of creating a mix between them and potentially adding some effect on one or the other, I can start getting sounds that are more like this. That was one variation. That was another variation. Okay, that one had this kind of delay thing on top of it. Okay, so the point is, I don't want to concentrate on like the aesthetics of the sound because it is an older piece, so I don't know if I would do it the same way today, but just listen to what happens to the depth dimension of the sound object. Like that has some depth to it because it's very spatial, that you can hear the reverb. But that's nothing. That is a flat sample. There's nothing there at all of any interest, and same with that one, But put together by layering things, and yeah, it's vertical layering, but it's also layering different spaces together. And when you're EQing them, you're kind of blending them together, and that's, regardless of like the aesthetic interest to you, is a much richer sound than what we started with. Is kind of the point. And this is an approach that's super common in film sound design. Like have you ever heard, like, think of like Lord of the Rings or something? Think of Lord of the Rings, like whoever your favorite character is in the fantasy is whips their sword out of the sheath and it glints in the sun, and as he pulls it out, it makes this kind of like kind of sparkly sound. That's not what a sword sounds like. That's probably like 6 or 7 sounds layered together to create what we think is a real sword sound. This is the irony, is that if we heard the real sound of the real sword, we would say that's fake. That's, oh, that sound engineer didn't know how to record the sword sound. That doesn't sound like what we imagine it to sound like. So this kind of hyper real, this sound that has layers of depth, even within one sample, is created using this layering approach. And a way to do it, you can do it in Audacity, and you can do it in other software as well, like here in Pro Tools, in Logic. I have different sounds, all derived from the coin, all labeled, as you can see, coin low, coin mid, you know, so I can find my way later. But now I can start thinking about how to combine them in different ways. So this is one variation. And what I would basically do is I will just loop it. And now I'm going to start thinking, how can I, it already has more dimension to it than it had before. And this low one is really helping. You know, there's some resonance there, but that low one is really helping. But especially with the low one, I think I know what it's going to do in the sound. It's going to give me that low resonance. And it's going to give me that high resonance, which I like. Okay, so, but in the middle, there's probably some stuff I can clear out. So this is how I would start approaching EQing here with a sound like this. And it's a fairly rich sound to play with. I can immediately see with my analyzer, and I can hear that there's really not a lot of high end here. Although I suppose, no, it's because I transpose it down, so there's just nothing there. What I would start with is, even though it's a low sound, I'm going to put a filter at 30 hertz. They're just, if you want low oomph, make sure you're playing with a subwoofer. That's all you have to do. Don't boost under 30 hertz. It's not going to sound good when you have a subwoofer, actually. So I usually clear things a bit down there, even on a low sound. Now I can see that my peak is around here, that low resonance peak. So I'm gonna again go with an EQ with not super high Q, but not super wide either. Q is the width of your bell, if you're not familiar. So it's a ratio between the bandwidth and the height of the boost. Again, I'm not boosting too much, because if I really boost a lot, you just hear this resonant filter effect, okay? Which is cool, but it's not what I'm looking for right now. I'll just start sweeping. So this is one of my high resonances. I'm sorry, can you see the plugin this time? Yeah, okay, great, great. Okay. Now there's something, I felt like I found something there. Like there's a nice, oh, 120, there's something nice. If I keep going down. I don't know how it's translating over the bandwidth here. I don't know what Zoom audio compression is like. I really hear that I can add some oomph around 50, and I don't mind doing it because this is the sound that's going to sit in the bottom, so it's all right. Then there's something I can do around here, 100 to 200. It's weird. There's like, it can add a bit of clarity, but I can also try to remove it and see what that sounds like. And I think I kind of prefer it removed. And I would say that I try to keep, like a good rule of EQing is that you cut more than you've boosted in your EQ. I think that's a good rule of thumb for mixing. So I'm never sorry to cut a little bit more. Now, what's happening here with the high resonance is a different kind of ball game. Let's decide how much do I want to hear it, you know? And can I find a harmonic above it? It's possible. There's not a lot in this sound in that sense, but try. So 395, I need to look around 7 something. No, it doesn't really seem like there's something here. There's like another I really wanted. If I wanted to introduce more ambiguity in the sound, I could do this very extreme EQ boost. But that's because I don't know if you can hear it. Maybe I'll boost the overall a little bit. But we kind of have another little, like this is very consonant, because if that's what we want it to be, we can keep it this way. But another variation would be, and maybe even without that boost. I mean, we have bass movement here, basically, just by changing the EQ a little bit. Or we can have that tension because those notes are very, very close together. So this would be one. Let's say I'm happy with this EQ, and now I have other sounds that they need to share the space. So I'd be approaching this. Now I'm starting to think about mixing almost. I'm not mixing a whole track, but I am mixing more than one sound together. So I think it's a great way to look at EQ in this way. This is Logic. It's you know, honestly, it's not my favorite, but it works and it's fairly easy to get, and it does have a frequency analyzer in the EQ that comes with it, so it's really nice in that way. So if I have my second sound here, I can already see that the spectrum is really different, and I could spend time looking into this sound and seeing what's in it and what is more interesting and less interesting. But in the interest of time, I'm going to EQ reactively to my first EQ. Okay, so the idea is that these two sounds are lined up together, and wherever I'm boosting from one, I want to make room in the other if there is competing energy there, and I'm going to fit these two together this way, and that's where you get dimensionality. That's where you get depth, you know. So I know that I don't need anything low here because there really isn't very much. Just to here's for the second sound I'm EQing, right? So all of this, I really don't need it. I'm getting it from my first one, from my other sound anyway, so it's just cluttering. So now I added these resonances here around 500, and I know there's stuff here because I can see it. If we just sweep through a little bit before we bring the other sound in, 500 hertz is like, it's the sound of a cardboard box. Okay, it's this sound. It's like telephone bandwidth, and quite often there's a lot of it, and quite often I actually love this frequency range, but I find it's a sound, you know, and it's not necessarily the best part of the individual sound. So I think I'm going to carve it out here in this example. I'm going to kind of scoop scoop a lot of this middle out, okay? And now I can think a little bit about the low mids, which is not fantastic in this sample either. I don't think there's anything particularly interesting, but you know, since I did cut a bit there, I might even boost it a tiny bit, just to blend them together a little bit. It's a bit wider. But you know, there might be some interesting high harmonics here, so I'll just check it out briefly. That's the high resonance. I mean, that's actually this transposed, right? Like this is the same sound, but transposed not quite as low as the first one. So, okay, we can keep this here. You know, we can keep going like this. Like I'll always look in between 1 and 2, because there's going to be like that here, all this stuff here. That's too much of a boost into my ears, but like it could be a nice highlight. Just 3 dBs, very, very subtle. Anyway, we would keep going like this. We'd keep going like this, and I would be adding the sounds, and I'd be EQing them, and then I'd be starting to pan them. And then maybe I would add a little bit of effects, and then eventually, I mean, I'm not composing yet. I'm just building a sound, and then I would export this, and this would be called, you know, whatever, bass drum 1 or impact sound or whatever, you know, genre specific terminology you want. And I would be making variations of this. And then when I have a good number of them, then I can start composing. And I know that each sound, there's still going to be mixing. There's still going to be, I'm still going to be messing around with things, changing things, but each sound is going to have this kind of 3-dimensionality to it that I've spoken about. And there is, you know, I didn't add any reverb on here. You know, I'm just there's a resonance in the sound, and with just a bit of volume automation and pan, I've given this sample a sense of space. And as it loops, I'm kind of like, yeah, you know, this could be a pulse. This could be in a dance show, you know, this could be like the driving low pulse for whatever's going on. You know, dancers, they always need a pulse they can count to 8 with, so it's always good to give that to them. There's, you know, so much that I thought we could maybe get into, and we didn't yet, so I apologize. But I mean, the idea of the EQ, I mean, this was for me a very brief exercise in EQing. I mean, I would be looking at EQ a lot more if I was actually developing these sounds. And in fact, you know, while this was working with the sound objects that I gave you, you know, this could be done with any kind of sample, like the Ligety samples. You know, would be a good thing to play with, for instance, because it's a real sound mass, and if you had a few together, you really would need to EQ, thinking about like, where am I boosting in this sound, and where am I carving it out from the other one, and how do I fit them together so that they each occupy, yeah, this kind of more 3-dimensional space in the sound world. Another option, or maybe something that I kind of want to show you would be, we didn't talk so much about space in terms of like how to simulate space realistically. Reverb, you know, we can always pop a reverb plugin on. But one thing that I really like to do, and it'll be the last thing I show you before maybe we leave a bit of time for questions, is, you know, I put all my field recordings into this session. Okay. Now, imagine I've already developed all my small sounds, and I have clusters, and I have composites, and I have a sound bank, and I load them in my sampler, and whatever, Maximus B patch or straight in Logic or whatever DAW you're using. But now I also want, I know that I'm going to need other musical functions in my piece, so not just percussive sounds. I might want things that are more stretched out, things that are more atmospheric, and field recordings are tricky to work with because you need to do a lot of EQ. But if you do too much, you start to really lose the field recording aspect of it. And there's always a temptation, I feel, to add a reverb on it, you know, because it just makes it sound, it you know, smooths out a lot of stuff in the recordings, and it sounds good to our ears, you know. So there's a reason to use reverb. But I want to show you one way that is a bit of a parallel to the way that I was working with the sound objects, working with reverb, that won't clutter your mix. Okay, it's a way of using reverb as a way of stretching sounds or adding something texturally without it being like a big wash of space. Because once you have more than a few of the big washes of space in your piece or song or whatever, and I would say the more rhythmic, the less reverb you should have, you know, like it can really overpower, like it can clutter it and muddy up your mix. So here's a little approach that I like. I have my my field recordings. I've actually layered them all together, and I haven't EQ'd any of them yet, but I certainly would be doing that. So, like for instance, the restaurant here, you know, I'd be, you know, take a look. Okay. I know that it's, again, nothing low, but I'd be starting to think about how these things come together, and I would probably, I could find some low conversation here. I can find this really nice, you know, high resonance here. So I'd be sculpting it to give it a bit more dimensionality just with EQ. But what I'm going to do here is a bit different. I'm going to send my sounds, all of them actually, I'm going to send them to 3 buses. Okay, so it's an auxiliary send. It's the way that you would traditionally do use reverb. And I, you know, sometimes you have a few convolution reverbs and maybe your CPU is running a bit low and you want a little bit more. And I'm not even messing around with a nice reverb here. I'm using Silververb, which is a plugin that Logic had since 2002 when I started using Logic. So it's been a little while. And, you know, I just put a couple of different settings. I have 3 different settings. They're not super big reverbs, but they're you know, you can hear the tail. And I'll show you how that works. So we'll just play just with the reverb. Okay, this is one reverb. It's a different one. Slightly different settings. You can see that if I had all of these, you know, in my mix, even if I turn them down, I mean, now my mix has no dimensionality. But like now, my mix is a soup, you know, there's no definition to it whatsoever. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each one of those reverbs. I'm going to put a tiny bit of distortion on it. It's just an example. It's what I like to do. But like you can use any plugin, something else, spectral. You put it after the reverb. It's very rare to use reverb this way, like in the classical studio sense. It's always the last thing in your chain because you want to get that space. You want whatever you're doing to the sound to have that space. But I really like put an effect after your reverb. And the distortion is just to kind of give it a bit of a character and also to kill a little bit of the tail of the reverb. And then I'm going to put a bandpass filter on top of that. I love bandpass filters. Like I said, I love EQs. I love filtering as a technique. And bandpass filters is a high pass filter and a low pass filter put together. Okay, so it's most commonly used to create the telephone effect. You put a bandpass, you cut the lows, you cut the highs, you have a limited bandwidth. Sounds like you're talking to a telephone. But what I like to do with this approach is, if I just play my reverb 1, okay, my first bus of reverb, I'm going to add a bit of distortion. I didn't really work on the sound, and I don't really need to, because I'm going to be filtering almost everything out of it, except for a band between 600 and 800 hertz. Okay, so my high pass filter is set at around 590, 600, and my low pass is at around 800. Okay, and I'm using a very a high slope. So my slope, it's going down very quickly. It's not tapering off. That's the LP60 as opposed to 12 or 24 or something like that. So you've heard it with the distortion. It sounds, you know, not very mix friendly, I will say. And then I'm going to add the bandpass in. Okay. I'm filtering almost everything out except for this band. And here I can start tuning it. And in fact, I did tune it a bit. And what I've done is I've done this 3 different times. So I have the same settings of the distortion, but I have different settings on my bandpass filter. So you can see my second one, I'm filtering at between 1,000 and 1,100. Let's add that second one in. Okay, so that's the second one. And here's the third one. Different settings as well, right? Now, what's nice about it, for me, is that it gives you the dreamy quality of a reverb, but it's not completely uncontrollable in the mix. And it could be used on its own. I mean, you could do something like, you know, I'll perform it, so it won't be perfect, but you go from natural to, you can make a sharp transition, cover it up with one of those nice composite attacks that we've done to distract from the cut, and you can create this kind of real to imaginary, otherworldly vibe, you know. But I actually really love using these things as spectral accents on my field recordings. So right now, like now I'm just showing you the reverbs without the field recordings. But if I unsolo this, and I'm just going to bring them up in the mix, you know, like we'll start from 0 and bring them up in the mix. You know, just on the verge of the audible, you know, you bring it up, when you hear it, you just notch it down a tiny bit. And it's going to add these drones, for lack of a better word, but those are not synthetic drones. So they're coming from the sample itself that is playing on the adjacent channel. So it's following all the dynamics and all the internal characteristics that could be really interesting. And I think bandpass, like, it's such a nice tool to take and to just magnify one part of the sound. And again, the effect of it as like a visual filter, I think is really very powerful. Like I use this all the time, and you know, you can do it also with just a low pass filter. You don't have to use a band pass, but I just wanted to show this kind of way of dealing with reverb in a way that it's not simulating a real space, it's simulating an imaginary space. or like space has a almost metaphoric kind of sensibility to it, but it's actually mix friendly. You can have 6 of these in your mix. You can't have 6 cathedral reverbs in your mix. So it's just as a little thought that the reverb doesn't have to be the end of your audio signal chain, and actually that it can still be an aux. You don't have to throw it in your inserts. Like, you can still use it as an aux. That's still a really good way of dealing with reverb, but it doesn't have to be the last thing that you do. And sometimes you can separate it more. You can have an aux just for your reverb, and then send that aux to other auxes where you have your filters, where you have other effects that are starting to mess with the performance of that plugin. So yeah, so I'll kind of pause it there. I'm really happy to entertain questions about anything that we've covered or haven't covered. Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't get to like go back and forth on every single exercise, but I hope you can take it and take the approach and take the you know, the mental shift towards the idea of a sample and run with it in whatever direction, aesthetic direction you happen to be running in. I think it'll enrich whatever direction that is. Yeah, so thanks, it was fun. And like I said, questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, I'll blab on for another 10 minutes or so.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious about your preferences of recording when you're recording samples,
Yeah.
whether you're recording like in a studio or if you're doing a field recording, if you have a preferred microphone or preferred kind of sort of way you go about doing that.
Yeah. You know, it's so funny, like thinking like I think I would have answered that question really differently 5 years ago, you know, like it depends on what I want to achieve. You know, if I want to do really crisp field recordings, then yeah, I want to get a high quality recorder, and I want to get a couple of omnidirectional mics. Like, there's a company named DPA that makes really nice mics, but that's like, if I had access to those things, then, and I thought that was the direction I need to go with this piece, then I would go in that direction. But let's say I don't have access to those things. Well, I'm going to take a different direction in the piece. You know, like that's how I'm going to approach it. And I mean, I think, like, I hate the notion of good gear, you know, like, of course there's high quality tools, but like, to give it a visual equivalent, because we can be a bit gear centric with sound, you know. You can make a movie with your iPhone. Like, that doesn't affect your script, you know. And in fact, there are movies made with iPhones, and some people really like the aesthetic of that, you know. So like, have access to high quality recording equipment. Let's say I'm stuck with my phone, you know, like, that's like the worst nightmare, just your phone. I know that I'm going to really process those sounds, and I'm going to equalize the difference. You know, if my sound isn't high quality to start with, I'm not going to try to make it super high quality sound. I'm going to play with the lo-fi aesthetic. I'm going to play with a lot of filtering. I'm gonna accentuate some of the lo-fi-ness. Maybe I'll use more glitchy kind of samples. Maybe I'll use like a distortion with not a lot of high end on it, so that it has something in there, but it's something that was actually in there. I'm accentuating something and aestheticizing something, even if that is low quality. You know, I think in a studio you can just do so many things in terms of mic placement, and that it's always easier. I would say, if it's anything that you want to record, which is literally an object, it's better to do it in the studio, and it's always nice um, to spend a couple of extra minutes and set up a stereo pair as opposed to a single microphone. And then you record your object in stereo. You can always reduce it to mono later if you want, but it's very difficult to go the other way around. So like the coin recording, which, as I said, I'm pretty proud of, and I have lots of coins recordings because of that. I really set it up on a table with a stereo microphone pair so that you can't really control where that coin is going anyway. But when it starts moving around, it's panning for free, and our ears respond to that. So stereo miking is, I think, if you're dealing with a sound object, it gives you an extra thing to play with. But like I said, I feel like it all depends on what are the goals and that I have going into the project, and then what are the resources I have to, and I kind of try to meet somewhere in the middle.
I have a question.
Yeah.
It's going back to the 3 sends you had with the filter at the end of the
Yeah.
reverbs.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering specifically what you're looking for with the distortion, like if any saturation would work, or like anything would work.
Yeah, it's just an example.
Yeah.
I mean, to tell you the truth, it's basically an overdrive. I mean, it's a very low. There's not a lot of distortion on the sound in terms of the
Okay.
drive on that I had in that particular example. I mean, it could be interesting to try it with a lot more distortion, or a lot, or just an overdrive. I do like the overdrive kind of sound. Because then when I'm filtering it, when I bandpass filter it, it's still smooth. If I'm going to put a lot of drive on the distortion, it's going to have a harsher quality even within that limited band. But I would say that the idea is to take away a little bit of the reverb in some ways.
Okay.
That's what I'm doing with the distortion, and it could be done with another spectral plugin. I'm not thinking EQ. I'm thinking like I mean, you could put an auto filter on it. I just don't like auto filters, but like you could mess the sound up with whatever. But the key is to actually disturb the envelope and like reflection pattern of the reverb, and just a little bit of messing with that, like a little bit of distortion. Think of it as a little bit of wave shaping, really, is just gonna take away that cue of that's a reverb. It's gonna kind of like I don't know, like not unfocus it. Actually, it makes it more focused, because it kills some of the tail, and I mean, in a weird way, it's putting a space inside a virtual environment. I mean, you're kind of like embedding one thing in the other, and the more you twist it there, the less it's relating to the original spatial experience. So the reverb is really used as a way to have a droney envelope, more than it is to simulate space in this example. And because I'm not trying to simulate space, I'm actually trying to get away from it a little bit, because I don't want too many reverb plugins, washing out my mix. I'm gonna tone down the reverb on the reverb by processing it in some other way, even if it's subtle, to take it a little bit out of that domain,
Great. Right on. Thanks. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. It's just by the way, it's just a personal thing that I like to do. It's not something that I don't know if I've really seen somebody else do it, and there are other ways to get to these sounds. But I do feel that it's like, again, thinking about dimensionality and like layers of depth, it's like a really nice in-between layer between right up front, nothing on it, just close mic recording, and like cathedral reverb, back of the room. It's creating shades in between, and actually the depth comes from having multiple points in space, not just very close and very far. So it's a bit coming from that angle as well.
Any final questions before we tonight? Yeah, I also really loved watching all that, and
I'm glad to hear it.
yeah, thanks. So, like, I do lots of workshops for my job, and I feel really lucky when I can also personally gain a lot, which this was a good example of that. So thank you for coming and enriching Paved Art and Holophon's workshop.
Thanks for inviting
series.
me anytime, and hopefully I have good memories of Saskatoon. I told you before, so I hope someday to be back in some capacity. So we'll see.
For everyone who came, if there's ever anything you'd like to revisit from this workshop, we will probably within a week or two have it up on our archived virtual workshops on our website. And I believe Holophon also archives theirs on their website as well. So you will be able to relive this and go through different pieces if you need to revisit. Thanks again to everyone, and especially to Adam and to Holophon for partnering with Paved Arts. And have a wonderful evening, and we will see you all soon.
Good night.
Thanks.
See you later.
Good night, everyone.